for Chapter 6 of the Handbook, Flaring and Venting. Welcome to our guest speaker for this presentation, Casey Michaels, who's legal counsel with the International Energy Agency based in Paris. Casey was also one of our contributing authors of the handbook. The handbook can be found at this link, so do take a look. While several of the topics for this chapter will be covered in this presentation, that will be a greater resource for more details. And a huge thanks to our funder, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources, for funding the handbook and this work. So with that, Casey, I'll turn it over to you to cover Chapter 6.
Thanks, Priya. So in this chapter, we will focus on regulatory options for reducing flaring and venting. This is a part of a three-part Chapter 5, 6, and 7 that each look at different regulatory strategies. Chapter 5 being on LDAR, this one on flaring and venting, and 7 on process standards. So what are we talking about with flaring and venting? The key elements that we'll go through in this presentation. So the first, this is really about regulatory options that reduce flaring and venting, which is one of the primary ways that regulators can reduce oil and gas methane emissions due to the fact that flaring and venting are large sources. One other point to emphasize is that the technologies needed to reduce or eliminate routine flaring and venting are pretty well known, and they can be deployed and have been deployed in a number of different examples and around the world. At the same time, in addition to the technology, on the regulatory side, there are a number of countries that have already adopted regulations designed to reduce flaring and venting. Compared to some of the other methane sources, flaring restrictions have a comparatively longer history because there's been effort to reduce flaring for going back a number of years. So this chapter will talk about some of the key features that typically appear in those regulations. We'll look at Colombia and Kazakhstan as two examples, kind of case studies to illustrate some of those principles. What are some of the key features of flaring and venting regulations? So there are actually really a number of different strategies, and each government really has to make a choice about what type of regulatory intervention they would like to make to reduce flaring and venting. Fundamentally, when we're talking about flaring and venting, these are deliberate destruction or release of gas. For the most part, this means either they are excess gas that can't be used or can't be delivered to a system that is deliberately flared to avoid the higher impact of venting, or they are pieces of equipment and processes that release emissions. So they're not unknown. The operators are aware of them, but there may be different reasons why they're not able to use the gas. In many cases, this is about associated gas, so where the primary production is looking at oil, and there may be lack of infrastructure to bring gas to market. Some of the key features. Measuring and reporting is one of the most standard requirements seen in this type of regulation. Many governments around the world require operators to report how much gas is flared or vented. Either that's through direct measurement or estimations using a known gas-to-oil ratio along with oil production volumes. It's a really important first step for regulators to know and understand the scale of the problem, how much is being flared and vented, if they are to put in place other types of restriction. Another very common restriction or policy is for the economic incentive. Often there will be royalties or penalty or a tax that is applied to unnecessarily flared or vented gas. So often this is based on the measure. If the company is required to measure and report, then the government responds by imposing this tax or royalty, which imposes a monetary incentive to reduce. On the positive side, like I said, positive incentive, in some cases, some countries basically create incentives to capture and use the gas. So if you use the gas, you get some benefit, whether that's you get to avoid paying a royalty or you actually get a subsidy or something else. And another effort is there's a lot of, on the technical side, effort to try to increase the flaring efficiency, including some countries that have put in place an expected standard that an existing flare must reach a specific efficiency level. Another thing is about that a lot of countries have done is they've imposed a ban on flaring and venting. Many countries actually have this. They say that it is illegal to flare and vent either full stop or unless you have a permit. And one of the most important features of regulations like these is that in almost every case, there are exceptions. So these are typically allowed for safety purposes, or to protect human health. So the law might say you may not flare gas unless necessary for a safety purpose. Some countries also have exceptions for where not economical. So you can flare as long as it's not economical to use. And this is one of the situations where there may be some potential to update regulations to be more strict. I'll look really briefly in the next couple slides at two examples. Colombia has recently reduced flaring through a significant regulatory effort and also effort by the national oil company, Ecopetrol. In Colombia, in general, there is a ban on flaring. It's not allowed, but there are limited exceptions for safety, planned maintenance, and economic non-viability. So that last one is key. If it's not viable to be able to find a use for the gas, then you potentially have an exception from the flaring requirement. This is also an example where operators in Colombia must submit information and justification every year for their annual flaring permit. So every time there is flaring, they have to justify what for. Was it an emergency? Was it for safety reasons? And they have to monitor and verify their flare efficiency level over time. And I think the requirement of the law requires operators to gradually reduce that over time. And if you don't, you're subject to mandatory penalties. Another example that you'll find in the handbook looks at the case of Kazakhstan. This is an example that has relied less on bans and exceptions and more on economic incentives. So essentially, the policy works by encouraging companies to use more of the associated gas and creating incentives for them to do so. So every operator is required to submit a plan for how they will use associated gas before they receive permission to construct new oil field projects. This is a project level plan. And the idea is it is intended to help create a domestic market so that gas companies, by developing a project level plan on how they will use the gas, will make more gas available that will create incentives for use instead of flaring or venting. Yeah, the final point is just to note a few resources in addition to the handbook that are available here from the World Bank, the Methane Guiding Principles, and elsewhere. And with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Casey. And again, if you have more questions on Chapter 6, Flaring and Venting, do take a look at the handbook. Big thanks to our funder for the handbook and this work, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources. And stay tuned for the next chapter in this series, which will cover equipment and process standards.